Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be doing my February wrap-up as well as discussing one book that I read in January that I totally forgot to discuss in my last video and my last wrap-up. But overall, February ended up being a really good reading month. It was an interesting reading month, I guess I should say. I started off not being able to read very much just because I was still dealing with some seasonal depression a little bit, which for me, like, yes, it has those depressive, sad symptoms, but also it makes me really tired. So I have a really hard time focusing on reading a lot of the time. Sometimes January ends up being a really good reading month for me, and other times, other years, it just ends up being a bit of a flop depending on how my symptoms end up going, and this year it just ended up being a struggle and it continued into February this time around. But I still ended up completing 4 books, and 2 of which were pretty long books by the end of the month, and especially considering I wasn't really reading much until the last week of the month. I feel pretty proud of the fact that I was able to complete 4 books, and I am still feeling good about reading. So we should be able to get into springtime and feel better and more energized, and hopefully be able to get more reading done than I presently have so far this year. But let's just get right into this. So the first book that I want to mention is one that I mentioned I read in January, but I totally forgot to include that in my wrap-up for January. So the book that I finished was The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. I really enjoyed this book. It was actually one that I read simply because my roommate read it and she really liked it, so she wanted to talk to us about it, and I figured it was one I had wanted to try, and I had gotten recommendations from several people to read it. So I just ended up grabbing it really quick on audiobook and listening to it over a few days, and I did really enjoy it overall. I think I gave it 4 stars. The writing was very engaging. I feel like the characters were interestingly explored, at least the 2 main characters. I feel like the other characters, the side characters, were not explored as well, but I feel like I expect that from a thriller. Like, I feel like a thriller is going to be much more focused on the plot as opposed to really developing the characters, all the characters super well. I could be wrong about that. Maybe there are thrillers out there that spend more time developing the characters than this one did, but when I have experienced thrillers, the few thrillers I have read and watched, I don't usually get that feeling. Usually, like, the couple main characters might be well developed, but not necessarily everybody. So as at least the main characters were well developed, they didn't feel flat in any way. They were very interesting. I guess I should tell you what this book is actually about in case you don't know. This book follows a therapist who begins working with a patient, a client who murdered her own husband and right after went completely mute. She does not speak to anyone, and she hasn't for years. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding why she did what she did. We don't really know her motivations behind murdering her husband or why she refuses to speak. And so this therapist is on a mission to basically solve that mystery of this woman. And like I said, it was very interesting. I felt like the plot was very intriguing. The twist at the end, the kind of big twist at the end, was very interesting, and it wasn't something I had guessed. I didn't have any major problems with this. I feel like mostly I just am not a huge thriller reader. I am one that I enjoy true crime a lot. I really enjoy true crime documentaries and podcasts. That's kind of my main, when I think of like mysteries, I want to do true crime as opposed to reading fictional stories or watching fictional stories. That being said, sometimes I do get in the mood for like a cop show or just a mystery show of some kind, and I do enjoy those on some level, but I have not experienced really loving a book version, a fictional story in book format that I can read that I have really liked for some reason. Like, I prefer to watch them, and I think that was the case with this. Like, it just didn't quite meet what I love in books quite as well, and I think it's just the genre as a whole that doesn't quite work for me, which is why I don't read it very much. But it was still entertaining. I think the audiobook version was a good route for me to go just because I do prefer watching and listening to these types of stories as opposed to reading them. One fault that's not as personal about it that did stand out to me was there is one plot point that I felt like was just left to not be explained very well. There are, of course, several red herrings throughout this story, and most of the red herrings ended up kind of being wrapped up in a way where they're still a red herring, but once you find out the truth, they still feel satisfying. You still feel like, okay, I at least understand what was going on there. But there was one red herring that I felt like was not explained very well, and I still have questions like, okay, then what was the situation there? What was going on? And not that you have to explain every single thing in a thriller, but there's also that sense of just kind of lazy writing of like, I put this here to be a red herring, and then that was all it was. Like, it doesn't actually matter. And I just felt like that was, like I said, kind of lazy writing in the way it was done. So that was something that did bother me about it. But I mean, overall, like I said, it was pretty good. I would say I'd recommend it if you're interested in thrillers, but I'm not a huge thriller reader, so I feel a little strange recommending a book when I'm not necessarily super knowledgeable about that genre. It was good for me, but that doesn't mean someone who reads the genre a lot would really enjoy it. But I feel a little more comfortable saying that I recommend this one just because it does have a pretty good rating on Goodreads, which, you know, isn't everything. Obviously, you don't have to love everything that has a good rating on Goodreads, but I'm sure a lot of the people who have rated it on Goodreads love thrillers and enjoy it, and so the fact that it's still high makes me feel like I can say, you know, I did enjoy it too, and it looks like a good amount of people enjoy it. So if you haven't heard of it, or you are just interested in reading it, just go ahead and try it, because I found it entertaining and interesting and relatively well put together overall. Up next, we have a book that I did finally finish. I was reading it across January and February for a read-along I'm hosting, and that is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I ended up giving this probably around 4 stars. This trilogy follows the life of Thomas Cromwell as he rose to power during the reign of Henry VIII, and also as he falls from power later on. This is really the build-up of him gaining Henry's trust and really starting to play a role in politics. And I really enjoyed it. I don't know, I had mixed feelings about it. I say I really enjoyed it because looking back on it and thinking about it, I enjoyed a lot of aspects about it. But the process of reading it was what I did not enjoy as much. It was very slow. It also is very stream of consciousness, which I'm not used to, but the way it's done in this one, it just made it so confusing and honestly hard to focus. It was hard to know who was talking, and as Thomas Cromwell's mind wandered through all the things he needed to do, my mind would start to wander through all the things I needed to do. And so it was just a lot of work to read, which in some ways I feel like was its main downfall. Like, I feel like I've talked to, so we're reading this, like I mentioned, as a group for a read-along, and one of my co-hosts is Marissa from Latently Bookish, and she mentioned that, you know, she felt like an author should not have to expect that much work on the part of their readers. And that's really how I felt about this. I would agree with that. I'm okay with a little bit of a challenging read because I think being able to encourage your readers to think a lot is a positive thing, but that's not quite what the work that went into this was. It was, you had to work to even stay focused on it because of the way it's written. Like I said, it's just hard to keep engaged with. Again, it's hard to keep up with all the characters which is just kind of part of the time period. So I don't hold that part of it as much against it. But it was also hard, like I said, to even know who was speaking, the way it was addressed. There was a lot of he said, but it didn't necessarily explain super well if it's talking about Thomas Cromwell said or someone he's talking to, who's a man, says. And so it was really hard to follow in that way. There's also times where it doesn't use quotation marks, and so you don't even know necessarily that someone is speaking unless you're really paying attention. So I just feel like the way this was written was not conducive to nice reading. That all being said, being someone who enjoys the history, I did feel like this really pulled me into the world of the Tudors. I felt like I was when I wasn't reading it and just thinking back on it, I really felt like I was experiencing this world of the Tudors. It felt very realistic. I found Thomas Cromwell to be such an interesting character. He is very manipulative and cunning. He's very good at watching people and knowing how to use their desires and their perspective on the world against them in order to rise up himself and those that he is trying to help. And so he's a bit of a snake-like figure, and yet because we're in his head and we're seeing every aspect of his life, we're able to realize that everything that's driving him to be that way it's not about himself necessarily. Like, it is on some level, but more than anything, it's about the survival of his family, and not just the family that he is biologically related to him, but also his found family. He really is able to create this home for a lot of people. He, throughout the novel, brings in people from different walks of life who just need a home and need a father figure basically, and he brings them into his home. And regularly throughout the story, while he's dealing with all these political maneuverings and stuff, we are brought back to his home. He thinks about things he's doing to his garden and things going on with his family and with his love life and even his cat. Like, we're constantly being brought back to that place, and it makes you realize that his whole drive is creating a safe home for people. And so he's very interesting, like I said, because he is so manipulative and he can come across as evil. In fact, a lot of characters in this book talk about how they're kind of afraid of him because he is so smart and intelligent and conniving, and yet what's driving that is such a positive, hopeful, and wholesome thing, in that he wants to create a family and a home for himself as well as for others. And so despite how hard this was to read, I love the way Hilary Mantel helps us get to know Thomas Cromwell. I love that it's not directly stated what his drive is. It's never directly stated exactly who he is. You're just learning who he is based on what's going on, where his focus is, what recurring thoughts are coming to his head, what recurring discussions are happening with him and other people. Basically, I would say Hilary Mantel is a master at showing rather than telling as far as character development, which I do really appreciate in her writing. I do also find her interpretation of people like Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Henry VIII to be very interesting. He clearly has such a fascination. He wants to fill this void in his life where his father, who was very abusive at the beginning of his life, he wants to fill this void of a father figure that he has in his life. So not only is he trying to be a good father figure to other people, but he also finds these people that he really looks up to. So first of all, it's Cardinal Wolsey, who kind of takes on this father figure role for him. And then when Cardinal Wolsey is gone, he ends up finding kind of this father figure in Henry VIII, who is younger than him, and yet there's still kind of the sense of, as Henry VIII is a king, Thomas Cromwell really looks up to him and respects him and wants to serve him as best he can. And so it's very interesting to see that dynamic. I also find Anne Boleyn in this book to be very interesting. Anne Boleyn, there's just so many ways to interpret her, and especially because we know so little about her overall, but we know enough to make her a very intriguing figure. And in this, Hilary Mantel takes the path of making her look, frankly, pretty unkind and very conniving, which I'm not saying she wasn't, but I do feel like, you know, very few people are like that all the time. And so I feel like I wish it had shown a little bit more of Anne Boleyn's intelligence and her care for her own religion, because this was a time where people were very passionate about their beliefs, and I feel like Anne Boleyn definitely was one. When I learn about her, I don't think she was a nice person, so I feel like that gets called out right. I think she had a short temper, she probably had a lot of failings that way, but I think she also probably had better control of her emotions, first of all, than this leads us to believe, simply because, you know, she's drawing Henry in, and I feel like she can't be that over the top with her emotions if she's able to keep the king's attention for that long. But I think she probably lets her emotions show more than other women. So I think that balance is not quite there in this book. And I think of Anne Boleyn, like I said, her passion for religion, she was beginning to look into some of the new ideas, and I'm sure some of that came from her family teaching her things and kind of influencing her that way. But I do, when I learn about her, like I say, in nonfiction, she comes across to me as someone who was very intelligent and made decisions about what she believed. She wasn't just being led on by other people. I mean, she lived in a court, in the French court with the French queen, who was very religious and who was also very intelligent. And so I feel like Anne would have brought that into her own, especially because it is known that Anne did respect her, this French queen. And so I would think Anne would absorb more of that personality than what is shown in here. But anyway, this video is already going on too long and I still have 3 books to talk about, so I'm gonna stop there. But suffice it to say, I did enjoy this in a lot of ways. There were a lot of struggles with it, but hopefully I will get more used to the writing style as the trilogy goes along and the second book will go better for me. Then I finished Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. I'm really not going to talk about this long because it is a reread. I did enjoy it, however, this time around I will say the characters annoyed me a lot more than they did the first time I read this. This follows Fanny Price as she is raised by her wealthy relations, and she's a very meek and quiet person. The family makes it very clear that she's not like them, she's not as rich as them, and therefore doesn't deserve as great of education or other things like that. And yet she has a lot of integrity, and so we kind of follow her as she watches a lot of chaos and drama in this home, and yet she's kind of the stabilizing force of the home, and over time the family begins to really recognize that. Like I said, I feel like this is now my least favorite Jane Austen. I mean, I enjoyed it, but I did find the characters much more frustrating this time around. Edmund I've always not really liked as a love interest. I feel like he's just so unobservant, but I also this time around felt really annoyed with Fanny. Like, I just very much felt like she just needed to move on. Clearly this guy was not interested in her and she just needed to move on, which I understand she has not very many options because they're in a very rural area. But I was really bugged that she was hanging on to this guy who was clearly not who she thought he was. Throughout the book, we're almost being convinced, trying to be convinced by Fanny that he's this great guy and he has all these great qualities. And yes, we're able to see a little bit of that, but I don't think enough to really justify Fanny hanging on to this idea of him that I feel like was not actually there. So unfortunately, I didn't like it as much this time around. That being said, I do like the relationship between Fanny and Lord Bertram. I love when he comes back from his business trip that he really begins to recognize her value, and I love how in the end that relationship just keeps building. I do appreciate the Crawfords. I think the Crawfords are the most interesting characters in this. Yes, they're awful in a lot of ways, but they have so much more vibrant personalities than a lot of people in this book. I feel like they're the most well-developed besides Fanny, and the way they're developed is just very interesting for me to read. So I find the Crawfords so fascinating. I would not want to hang out with them, but they are very interesting. And yeah, I'll just stop there. Like I said, it's a reread, so I don't want to overdo it, but suffice it to say, I still enjoy this book, but not as much as I used to. I gave it 3.5 stars, where before I think I gave it a 4, so it has dropped a little bit in my estimation, but I mean, I'm still willing to reread it in the future, and I feel like this is one that it will just change depending on where I'm at in life, how I feel about it. Then I did finish Vanity Fair by William Thackeray. I'm not going to take too much time with this one either, just because I do have 2 vlogs of my reading experience with it, so I will link those down below and in the cards if you want to watch either of those. If you don't know, this follows the story of 2 very different women, Amelia, who's very sweet and innocent and gentle, and Rebecca Sharp, who is very manipulative and does not care what people think about her, really, ultimately, only as far as it can get her things, get her material gain. And we follow their different lives and their different experiences based on their different strengths and weaknesses. And it was a very good book. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4.5 stars, so definitely better than either of the ones I've already mentioned. And yeah, I don't know too much to say about it. Like I said, I say a lot in those vlogs, so I did really enjoy it. I gave it 4.5 stars, and I really find Rebecca Sharp specifically so fascinating to watch. I think she's a complete sociopath, and it's wonderful to follow in this sort of setting where she's rising up in society. She's gaining and losing people's trust all over the place, and she's a predator. Like, she's genuinely a predator, and it's fascinating to watch her. I also came to appreciate Amelia and her friend Dobbin in the end. They were both kind of the perfect ones in the story, and I found them more interesting as the story went on, although they started off pretty flat for me. But overall, I enjoyed the characters in this. I liked the plot. It's one I would be willing to reread in the future, and I'm glad I was able to read it with some of you wonderful people. I hope you've enjoyed the read along if you've participated in that part of it. And yeah, it went well, and that's all I'm gonna say about it for now, because like I said, I did 2 vlogs on it, so plenty of thoughts there, won't take too much time here. And the last book I read this month was the hardest book I've ever had to read, and that was My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. And it was not hard in the fact that I didn't like it. In fact, I gave it 5 stars. It's already a favorite of the year. I loved this book, but it was so hard to read. So this story follows a girl who, when she was a teenager, she had a relationship with her teacher. And recently some accusations have come forward about this teacher having sexually exploited several girls in his classes, and she has never seen her relationship with him as abusive. However, she may be starting to reflect on the situation and realize that there were problems there. So we follow her in 2017 where these allegations are coming forward, and we also follow her back when this relationship was actually occurring. And so we're able to watch exactly what happened to her and with this teacher. And it was done so incredibly well. It really brought out the complexities of the situation, how much and in what ways this sort of abuse can affect someone, impact someone. It was creepy and uncomfortable, and like I read it in like 3 days, not necessarily because I was hooked, even though I was, but also because I knew I could not be sitting in this book for longer than a few days. Like I needed to get through it fast if I wanted to finish it, because I was not going to be reading it across a week-long span and be just sitting in this harrowing story that long. I just could not do it. But the writing was incredible. The way this author told this story was it just brought you into the reality of the situation, and just realizing, I have watched documentaries regarding situations like this, and this was the first time it really became, I don't want to say real to me because it has been, but it impacted my emotions in a way that I could really feel it as much as you can without having actually experiencing it. Like I was able to really feel the anger and hatred I would have, for example, if this happened to my sister. My sister's close to this age, and just thinking about that aspect of it really, I got so angry. Like I've never really felt that level of anger where you are like, I could kill this person, but that sounds so scary, but like honestly, thinking about something like this happening to my sister, there was a moment where I felt that anger of like, if I knew this was happening to my sister, I would have to be talked off the ledge of like wanting to murder this person. Like I genuinely felt that anger stronger than I've ever experienced it before. And I feel like that just speaks to the power of this story and how well it was written. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not this author has or has not actually experienced something like this, and she doesn't want to say, which is totally her prerogative. Go her. She recognizes that that's not necessarily what this book was meant to be about. It wasn't meant to be about her, it was just meant to be about all of them. And whether or not this happened to her, it's still very brave of her to have written this story, in my opinion, to really bring to light the realities of the situation and frankly pay genuine tribute to the actual stories of these women, not that very oversimplified idea that is often portrayed in the news and other resources, but really digging deep into the complexities and the psychological trauma involved in something like this. It was incredible. I loved it. Like I said, favorite of the year. And I feel weird. I would never recommend this to anyone because I think it's up to you whether you feel like you could handle it or not. And I don't feel like I'd feel comfortable telling someone I think they would be able to handle it, because like I said, I'm one that I watch documentaries about this, I listen to podcasts, I have experience delving into this topic, and yet this was still it was probably the hardest thing regarding that sort of topic that I've ever consumed, because yeah, it was just so hard. So keep that in mind going into this, but if you feel like you can handle it, if you feel like it might be worth your time, definitely give it a try, because yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was heartbreaking and harrowing, but I will say the comfort is it does have a mildly hopeful ending. It's not like everything's hunky-dory at the end, but you can tell she's going to move forward. The character is going to move forward. So sorry if you think that's a spoiler, but I feel like for some people, they need to know that there's some level of hope in the end for them to read it. So I will tell you that, but yeah, it's a great book and one I want to reread, but probably not for a few years. Anyway, that is it. That's what I read in February. I'm going to really quickly go over what I'm currently reading just so you can look ahead to next month and see what's going on. So I have started Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. So the read-along I was hosting for Vanity Fair, the next thing we're reading is Gone with the Wind because the main character in this is very similar to Rebecca Sharp from Vanity Fair. And so far I already think that I am going to like this better than Vanity Fair, so it's very strongly probably going to be a 5 stars. The writing is just much more rich and the character development is already much more rich. I'm literally not even 100 pages into it quite yet, but I can already tell it's just a richer story overall, so I'm very excited to continue with this. Another one I've been working on for months and I'm finally just going to finish this audiobook. I just need to. I'm tired of seeing it in my currently reading. I just need to finish it, especially because I'm loving it. I just keep getting distracted by other things. So David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I am loving this. Like right now, if I were to give it a rating, it would be 5 stars. So it's not that I'm not liking it. I just have been distracted. So now I'm doing it. We're gonna finish this and I will not start another audiobook until I do. And I should be able to by the end of this month for sure. So anyway, that's happening finally. We're going to finish David Copperfield. And then another one I had started and I just took a break from for a while, but I am getting back into at this point is Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. Also really enjoying this a lot. Definitely going to be a high star rating unless something terribly awful happens, but it's just very cheering. It's perfect to go into this after my Dark Vanessa, just to have something a little bit lighter to read. And it's not very long, so I definitely should be able to finish it pretty quickly. And yeah, so we'll continue with that as well. And yeah, that's where I'm at right now in my reading. Let me know down below if you've read any of these, your thoughts on them, some of your favorite books that you read in February, as I would love to know. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!